Hello, welcome. This is a OCR F583 A2 economics video for June 2015, if I've not said that already. Okay, so what I've done on the board there for you is kind of giving you a bit of a... Oh, sorry, change of view. I've summarised, because obviously this, as you can tell by the title of the video, is the data response part of the paper. Now, what I'd normally do when I go through past papers, I'll do question 1, then I'll go into question 2, etc, etc. Now, well, funnily enough, this is all question 1. What I was going to say is I don't split it up into individual parts of this data response, and all the data responses that will come after it for F583. And the reason being is because I discuss all of the bits of the information at the start of the video, and there's no point splitting it up, because it's not really a maths paper, weirdly enough. So anyway, let's kick off. So as I said, what I've done is I've summarised all the key bits of information. Now I've included a little bit more in there. I've repeated myself once or twice, and some extra bit of information that doesn't specifically relate to any other question. Now the key bits with these data responses is to pick out the key parts of the data response. Now I've obviously got the paper here, so I don't know if you can see that. Basically, it's a load of writing, as with every other data response you do, and they always leave some kind of big gap here. Now, I haven't written it specifically on this paper. I've summarised it on here, but that's essentially what I'd write. Just summarise the data response. You'd have to keep flicking through all of it, but obviously you know that. So, really, what this is about minimum wages and the effect of changing it to national minimum wage. It's quite relatable to today's economy as well. As I said, it's only 2015 this came out, so what it's essentially saying is the main things it picks up on is the change in the national minimum wage in the UK from 1999 to October 2014. And obviously it tells you a bit about inflation. We're actually given a table in this, which I've kind of crudely drawn on here. Just says the national minimum wage in April 99 was $3.60, and 2014 it's gone up to £6.50. The CPI in that time has gone from 100 to 144. Now remember, whenever it's 100, that's the base year, and basically any increase from 100 is the percentage increase. So that's 100% in 99. So that was the total wage, and then that 144 is basically it's gone up by 44%, and that's not the wage. Remember, that's the inflation because it's a CPI. Okay, and then this other bit, index of average earnings. Now that's completely wrong. We don't need to look. As I said, it's just a little bit of information they've given you that you don't need, but as I said, you know, just to fill some space, obviously. As again, I put some other information on there. Just the only other key bit you need to understand is that this wordy bit I put on the bottom. So in 2014, most EU countries had a national minimum wage which was 30 to 50% of their national average wage. So the national minimum wage is the wage that no one can charge below, but the national average wage is obviously just the average wage out of everybody. Now it's not the minimum wage, that's a different thing. Remember, national average wage is on total, so you obviously halfway between the people who earn the most and the people who earn the least, somewhere between there. So ideally that's what we'd want everyone to be earning, but obviously life doesn't work like that. And what I told, so 30 to 50 is the main, is the group of the EU countries that basically that there's no one below 30 and there's no one above 50 in terms of that percentage. But some of the countries like France and Belgium, it lists, are 45% or greater, so 45 to 50 really. So France and Belgium have a national average wage, national minimum wage, which is 45% of their national average wage, which is quite good. It's almost half it, so it's almost perfect. But as I said, you know, they've given it 45 plus. It's greater than 45. They haven't told us what it is, but you get the idea. Okay. And then this other bit of the information about 2009, 8.4% people employed in the EU were below or close to the poverty line. That's completely irrelevant. I've just put it on there as a bit of a background, really. As I said, the only really key bits of this that relate to the questions are the table and that bit I mentioned before about the EU countries having a national minimum wage, which was 30 to 50% of the national average wage, and then a bit about France and Belgium. So the table and what I just mentioned there, the two key points you need for this data response. As I said, the rest of that is really pointless. So as you can see, there's loads of information you don't need there. Okay, so somebody's going to write some questions. Now, this data response I must imply was quite a hard data response. I mean, partly I wasn't taught it, so I had to do the data response off the top of my head. But as I said, it's easier than you might think. I think the main problem that people I did it with had was they overcomplicated some of the questions. So I'm going to point out the key things, and it's always nice to be able to relate it. Don't be afraid to relate to F581. Okay, so bit of background, wasted 2 minutes of your life there. Okay, so using figure 1, which is this table, as I said, I'll send you the PDF of this. Oh, I'm not sure if there's a PDF. Right, so using figure 1, which is said that table, calculate the percentage change in the main rate of the UK national minimum wage between April 1999 and October 2014. Now, surprisingly enough, some people I did it with got this wrong. Now, this is the simplest calculation. This is before GCSE. This is how easy this is. Okay, so the percentage change in the national minimum wage. So basically, we're looking at this part here of the table. So the change from £3.60 to £6.50. What percentage has that increased by? Now, obviously, you're not going to do it as a percentage increase of £6.50. Basically, percentage change of something is the change over. So what it's changed by over the original figure times 100. And basically the change is the change from £6.50 to so the change between from £3.60 to £6.50. So this is part A, remember? So it's £6.50 take 360, because that's a change over 360, which was the original figure. Times 100, and now we get the percentage increase, which I got to be 80%. Okay. Alright, so as I said, that's fairly standard. Really basic, easy maths, easy marks. Explain, so part B says, part II says, explain what's happened to the real value. Now, whenever you see real in economics, it's to do with removing inflation. Of the UK national minimum wage over the period 1999 to 2014. Obviously it says April 1999, but just simplify it for you. Okay, so a key thing that you need to not to do is say, because we've worked out an increase in the wage. Now it's the increase with inflation, because obviously prices have increased and they've included that in the wage increase as well. If that says the national minimum wage, it didn't say the national minimum wage without inflation, so the real national minimum wage. Otherwise, why would it be asking us to calculate this question? So yes, that is the increase in the wage, but it's the increase in the distorted wage. So it's the increase in, it's like the increase in nominal GDP. You wouldn't take that as a given figure, as an increase in GDP for obvious reasons. And also they've told us this CPI figure here. Now, as I said, 100 was the original price of a base year of a product, and that price has increased to 144% of, so it was 100% of what it was, and it's increased by 44%. So prices in the economy have increased by 44% according to the CPI, the Consumer Products Index. So if prices have increased by 44%, so as I said, you don't necessarily need to write this down. So if prices have increased by 44%, well actually you do, it's a wordy question, it's a 2-marker. So basically, prices have increased by 40%. So what you need to state for 2 marks is a worded question. You need to state that prices have, the national minimum wage is increased by 80%, but because the inflation is increased by 44%, we need to take that away, because that's the effect of inflation. So that leaves us obviously with 36%. So therefore wages have increased in the economy by 36%. Let me just double check I've not missed anything out in terms of pointing out a few key things. I think I should have done. Sec. Yeah. So it's just a case of that the wages have increased faster than the rate of inflation. So obviously real wages have increased by 36%. 2 marks, okay? So 1 mark for stating about that the real wages increased, and another mark for saying it's increased greater than the inflation. But you could have just shown that by that calculation and kind of explained it with some words why you've done that calculation. So basically what you need to do that calculation for a mark and explain what that shows for another. It's the same thing as I said before, but that's how you get the 2 marks for this question. Okay. I feel I probably need to rub that out in a minute because actually yeah, I'll rub it out now. So that's part I and part II. Okay. So that's part A over and done with. So part AI was talking about the change in the national minimum wage in terms of percentage, and the second was the increase in the real national minimum wage. Okay. So therefore part B says, using marginal revenue products theory, explain why countries such as Greece and the UK have a different minimum wage rates for different age groups. Now, you can talk about any age group you like. However, the 2 most common that you want to talk about in terms of marginal revenue product theory is the younger generation, and obviously old biddies as well. Now, I wouldn't necessarily talk about the old biddies, although you can do, if it does specify in the mark scheme, you can. But I'm going to go through as we're going to talk about youths, because there's a lot more to get your teeth into, not necessarily young people. I wouldn't recommend you just go out and bite someone on the street. Please don't. It's just a term. You can get some people taking it quite literally, and I'll probably get blamed for it in today's world. Anyway, so the key thing you need to start off by saying in this question, it's worth 3 marks, you need to state what marginal revenue product is. Now, marginal revenue product. The way I always think of this is, well, it's marginal revenue times marginal physical product, because it's marginal revenue product, so it's made up of 2 things. Okay, so that's the way you think of it. Marginal revenue product equals marginal revenue times marginal physical product. Okay, so what do these 2 things mean? Just to recap. Well, marginal revenue is the extra revenue an extra worker brings in to a firm. Marginal product, physical product, is the extra output one worker brings to a firm. So the total, therefore, is marginal revenue product is the extra revenue one worker brings into a firm. Okay, so that's the first point you need to make, and then you need to relate to the question. So it says, using marginal revenue product theory, which we've just described, defined, explain why countries such as Greece and the UK have a different minimum wage rates for different age groups. Okay, so as I said, I personally would quite like to talk about the younger generation in this way, because you don't necessarily need to compare Greece and the UK. It's not asking that, it's just giving examples of countries. So that's the key thing to watch out for in this question. It's not asking to compare Greece and the UK, it's just giving examples of countries. So it's quite a snidey question, actually. I think it's almost getting to compare when you don't. So, as I said, the first thing you do is define this marginal revenue product, as we've just done. Then you start to say, as I said, the younger generation. Now, the younger generation, obviously we're in education, but, well, most of us are anyway. So, if the people that have just finished education and just about to start work, why do they have a different marginal revenue product to other age groups? As I said, you can pick any age group, but I'm going to pick the younger ones. Okay, so the first thing that I would discuss, well, obviously, either one, the first thing you need to talk about is, well, the main difference is that we have less experience. You know, you see them jobs, you know, we'll give you some experience, but to get this experience, you need to have some experience. So it's like a backward stab, really, in today's world. But anyway, as I said, the key thing from that you need to say, the first thing you need to talk about is the skill. So that the younger generation, so younger age groups, generally are less skilled because they have less experience due to the obviously lower experience. So that's the first few points you need to make. Now, obviously if they're less experienced, they're able to add less in terms of product. They're not as productive. So that's the first thing. So if they're less experienced, therefore they are less productive. And if they're less productive, therefore they add less to marginal physical products. So less to MPR, so marginal physical revenue, marginal physical product. So MPP, marginal physical product. Therefore, they obviously add less to marginal revenue product. So therefore, because MRP is another way of saying demand, so basically, just to recap, they are younger age groups, so therefore they are less skilled as they have less experience, therefore they are less productive than a more experienced worker, so therefore they add less to marginal physical product because they can't produce as much as someone else, and therefore, obviously prices are all the same, so marginal revenue considered to be the same, so therefore they add less to marginal revenue product, and as we know, marginal revenue product is equal to demand, because you know when we saw the demand curve, that's marginal revenue products. So if therefore, as marginal revenue products equals demand, therefore we can say the demand for these workers is lower. And if the demand for these workers is lower, therefore, assuming the supply stays the same, they have a lower wage equilibrium. Basically, let me just finish writing stuff. Okay, so if they have a lower so if they have a lower demand, basically their demand curve, we normally have supply and demand, something like that, a crude drawing of it. Instead of having it up here like you would have for most workers, the demand for youth workers might be somewhere, not youth workers, but you know, younger generation workers might be lower down. Okay, so they would have a lower wage rate and they would be lower in demand. Okay, so the lower wage equilibrium, therefore their wage is lower than other age groups, and that's all you need to say. It looks like a lot, but I've just kind of split it up into probably more than you would need to, but I've just kind of tried to help you out by trying to define it a little bit there. Okay, so that's part B. That's 3 marks there. Right, so the next part I'm going to have to rub that out. So that's part B. So part B said, using marginal revenue product theory, explain why countries such as Greece and the UK have a different minimum wage rates for different age groups. Now, as I said, you could pick the older generation, but I've just picked the young one, saying they're less skilled, they're low experience, less productive, therefore they had less to output or less to marginal physical product, therefore they had less to marginal revenue product, and as we know, marginal revenue product is the same as demand, so therefore there's a lower demand, they have a lower wage equilibrium, therefore they are paid less in terms of the wages than other age groups, and that's your final point for part B. Part C says, using a diagram, analyse the impact of trade unions under a system of collective bargaining. Now that sounds incredibly complicated, but let's just refresh a second while I'm rubbing this off. What is collective bargaining? Well, obviously that's the first thing you need to define after you draw your diagram, but so I'm just going to recap it a second. Okay, so collective bargaining. Well, collective bargaining just illustrates the point, so you might want to be writing this down if you're answering the question just after you might have drawn a diagram. So, as I said, collective bargaining just illustrates a point that one worker asking for a wage increase or improved living conditions is more effective than just one worker asking for that. Because if you look at it from an employer's point of view, because obviously this is whose power they're trying to reduce in terms of the ability to turn this wage increase down or whatever it might be. Obviously, in this question it is the wage increase. If that one worker said, okay, well, you're not giving me a pay rise, I'm going to, Johnny, go outside and sit down and just do whatever. And I'm not going to work for you, I'm going to go on strike. Well, that one worker is easily replaced. However, and it's not really disruptive because maybe another worker could do their job and, you know, it'd be over in an hour and the worker would be sat outside not getting paid and probably would get sacked. But if the whole workforce, now obviously in today's economy it's a lot harder because the service sector people are spread over further departments, so it's harder to communicate. So therefore it's harder for all of this collective bargaining to go ahead through trade unions, because obviously you have to pay to be a part of it. But anyway, going back to the actual question. So basically, you just have to talk about the first point. It's collective bargaining is just the point that illustrate that the way of illustrating that one worker having a say in something is more effective than just a group of workers having a say in something is more effective than one worker, because it's more disruptive to potential production, and therefore the employees are more likely to listen, so that the group of workers has more of a chance of improving their living conditions or working conditions by improving the pay rise or standard of living or whatever you might want to go on to. Okay, so how would we analyse that with a diagram? Well, I tell you what I did. Now this is completely wrong, and I'll explain why. And I'm only explaining it in case some of you might have thought of doing it. I drew the natural rate of unemployment. Yeah, natural rate of unemployment, which just shows that the employment when the wage is in equilibrium. But remember, it's not talking. If you wouldn't have thought that, then please don't listen. But if you did think of that, that popped into your head straight away. Don't know why I would. Don't know why I did mine. But I was pretty tired on the day of the exam. I'll say it was a mock. So anyway, the reason I thought of it was because they're asking about trade unions, so I was trying to think of something overcomplicating it. I just thought, well, okay, it's going to be talking about impact of trade unions on with collective bargaining. So it's obviously going to be something about changing the wage rate. So I thought, okay, we'll try and make the wage rate higher, but they can't do it above. I don't know what I was thinking. The easy way of doing this is a simple supply and demand diagram. So, as I said, if you weren't thinking of natural rate of unemployment, please don't. It just confused you. So it's just a simple supply and demand diagram. Obviously, you would label the axes wage rate and quantitative labour, but because I'm lazy, I'm not going to just put a 0 there. And obviously that's the supply of labour and the demand for labour. Now, normally in a given economy, so after you've drawn this diagram and defined the collective bargaining, which, as I said, is just about the idea of a group of workers having more power over changing the wage rate or working conditions than one worker, as it's more disruptive to production. So after you've drawn the diagram and explained that, then you would start to explain, okay, well, normally in a given labour market, the wage rate would be W with an equilibrium at A, if you wanted to talk about that, with a quantitative labour demanded Q. And this is where supply of labour and demand for labour intersect. However, if a trade union stepped in and increased the wages for the workers by saying, okay, well, you're just going to increase these wages, or these workers are going to go on strike, okay, well, let's see what happens when they do that. So, increase the wages. W1. So, we've got a low level of demand at Q1, and we've got a higher level of supply at Q2. So, with this higher wage rate, it's obviously costing the employers more to hire someone, so they don't want to hire as much. If the price increases, then they don't want to hire as much. However, the workers are being paid more to work, then surely more people are going to want to work. Excluding the effects of the income and substitution effect, we're not complicating matters with that. Okay, so it's just a simple demand supply diagram, so therefore we've got excess supply of labour. Okay? So we've got excess supply of labour, therefore obviously this represents unemployment, because people are, there's too many people wanting the job than the employers actually want. Okay, so this is from collective bargaining. The employer is saying, okay, the worker's saying, okay, well, we want a higher wage rate. The employer saying, yeah, we can give you that, but we're not going to hire as many. So obviously that wouldn't be beneficial for a trade union. Right, okay, so back to the question. So when you've drawn that diagram, you've explained what collective bargaining is, what do you do then? Well, you just talk about the excess supply of workers. Sorry, one sec. And obviously you're assuming that because the productivity of the workers isn't increasing, there's no shift in the demand curve, there's no shift in any curve there's only an extension in supply and a contraction in the demand for labour. So obviously that represents an excess in supply of labour, so therefore that increases unemployment. Therefore we've analysed the effect of trade unions under a system of collective bargaining. Now if you were being pedantic, you would draw the supply curve. So we've done dash from W1 up to the supply. You might want to keep that going. But as I said, that's completely up to you. You didn't really achieve any extra marks for doing that. Okay, so obviously you get a couple of marks for labelling your diagram correctly, a couple of marks for explaining it, and the main explanation really needs to do is talk about the excess supply, and obviously you get a couple of marks for defining collective bargaining as well. Okay, so I'll probably not explain that 1D a little bit too well, but as I said, it's fairly simple. So it's just a case of supply and demand and having excess supply because the wages have been too high and more workers are wanting to work for that the employees are wanting to employ them. Okay, so we're going on to 1D now. So these are the harder kind of questions. It's the harder two anyway, and it's the ones we start having to look back at what we've recovered from the data, from the case study or whatever that we've been given. So the part 1D says comment on the impact of a public sector wage freeze on the labour market in a country. Okay, so first thing you need to talk about is what is the first thing we need to think about actually. So I need to talk about this. Is what is the public sector? Now obviously the public sector is anything that is government owned, so the NHS, schools, that kind of thing, for example. And a wage freeze is just a cap on the wages, so it can't go any higher than this, and obviously that will have certain effects that we need to do. And it's a comment on question, so that obviously means we have to talk about the benefits to an economy of a wage freeze in the public sector and a negative point as well. So it's the public sector, the private sector wages, they can continue and increase, but the public sectors can't. We're assuming they can't anyway in this question. Okay, so the first thing that would happen, and the most obvious thing, so assuming that the inflation increases because there's still buying in the public sector, so there's still aggregate demand increasing, so if we shift that aggregate demand curve, we're still going to arrive at inflation. So assuming inflation, so the first thing we're going to talk about is obviously the negatives of this. So if there is still inflation, so if inflation is increasing still, I'm saying that for a reason because we're going to do the opposite in a minute. So if inflation is still increasing, but the wages are being capped, so the wages can't increase. Now we were talking about real wages before. Real wages are the wages without inflation. So basically there was that gap, that 37% gap between the increase in the inflation and the increase in the wage rate. So if the wages have been kept constant, so basically we've got a wage rate here and the inflation rate here. Obviously wage rates are increasing higher than inflation before, but when they're capped, obviously the wage rate can't increase because they're capped, but the inflation is still going to increase. So basically all we're doing is narrowing the gap between the inflation and the wage rate. So the gap between the wage rate and inflation and the rate of inflation is the real wages. So therefore what we can say from that information is that the real wages are going to decrease. So if the real wages decrease, that's essentially, even though the worker may only be paying the same, but because inflation is increasing, the value of that money is decreasing. So that's why the purchasing power decreases. So the purchasing power decreases because obviously they've essentially got a reduced real income. Therefore, they can't buy as many things, so their standard of living goes down. And if their standard of living goes down, and we're assuming the public sector are still maintaining their standard of living, therefore income inequality increases. So there's a wider gap between the rich and poor, essentially, is what I'm saying. Obviously, this is between the public sector workers and the private sector workers. Okay, So that's what you talk about for the negatives of that question. Now you could go on to say, another point you could mention is talking about, okay, well the workers might choose to leave the public sector because of the wage has been capped, they're not locked into it. So obviously there would be a decrease in employment in the public sector, but we could go on to turn that into a positive in a minute. So that's why I've only really labelled that. I think that's quite a good point to go off. Okay, so any positives from a wage being capped in the economy? Well, we could look at this from the government's point of view. So, the government's point of view, if they cap the wages, they know the wages can't possibly go over that, and if they do, it'll only be one person just sneakily getting an extra £5, which obviously we assume not to happen. So, basically, what I'm saying is the government can predict their wages. They can predict their wage costs because, at the end of the day, it's the government that's paying out these public sector wages. So the wage costs can be predicted. So therefore, if they can be predicted, then the government doesn't have to borrow as much because obviously the real wages decrease if the government's getting... So basically what I'm saying is if the wages can be predicted, the real wages are also falling because obviously the wages are capped, so it's kind of doesn't go on for it, but you get the idea. So the real wages have fallen. So therefore, assuming that the income tax remains the same, basically the government's getting more in from income tax because obviously that's increasing with inflation, but the wages aren't. So therefore, the budget deficit decreases. So therefore, we can also say the national debt decreases as the government's having to borrow less and it's getting more in. Okay? Alright, so hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Right, so is there anything else that I need to talk about? Nope. Okay, so I'm not sure if you need to include a conclusion on this, but I did. So I talked about, so overall it depends on the duration of, so how long these wages are kept for, and obviously what level the lockdown at, because it might be reduced and we don't know, and obviously that would have varying effects on either of these. But another thing we need to consider is what is actually driving this inflation. Okay, because we said if inflation increases, wages, real wages decrease, so people enjoy a lower standard of living, increasing income inequality. But we're assuming inflation is increasing, might not be increasing, and what is it, if it is increasing, what is increasing it? Now, generally, what increases inflation is demand pull inflation, and that's the main kind of impact of it. Now, demand pull inflation is caused by an increase in aggregate demand. Increase in aggregate demand is obviously caused by an increase in the components of aggregate demand. Now, we've talked before in different videos about it is problematic if aggregate demand increases is caused by what we call debt-fueled debt-fueled factors such as consumer spending and government spending, because they have to borrow, they're not funded, they've got to be paid back in some way, so it's kind of short-term happiness really. Okay, so how does this relate to this question? Good point. So what I'm saying is, okay, so it depends what caused this inflation, because if it's consumer spending, and most of that consumer spending was done by the people in the public sector now, not necessarily it is, because private sector you get more money, but assuming it could be, we don't know, some highly paid NHS people, if they're not able to spend as much, therefore they're not able to contribute as much to aggregate demand, because the still public sector is quite big, so it's still going to contribute to a lot of consumer spending from aggregate demand. So if they're capped at their real wage, their real wage, as I said, will decrease, so their consumer spending will decrease, so therefore they're able to contribute less to aggregate demand, so therefore they're able to contribute less to demand pull inflation. So we might not have this. So in the short run, we might have this idea of inflation increasing. By the way, short run and long run, good thing to do in A2. Should have done it in AS, but anyway. So in the short run, yes, this could prevail in terms of we could have continued inflation increasing and all the rest of it. But in the long run, if most of the spending was done by the people in the public sector, they're not going to be spending as much, so they're not going to be able to contribute to inflation as much. So these effects won't become as pronounced in the long run in terms of the negative effects. We'll still have the positive effects, obviously, because they can't change. So that's one day. That's quite a nice one, actually. You just have to think round it a little bit, but it does sound quite weird, and I'll admit I wouldn't have got that in the exam. I didn't. I got 0 on that when I did it as a mock. But after looking over it, I've kind of hopefully I've explained it a little bit for you. Okay, so 1E. 1E is actually harder. That's why I said these last two parts of the data response, I think, are the hardest 2 questions of data response that I've ever seen. Now maybe that's just because my teacher hasn't properly done this topic. Well, they haven't yet, actually. But don't worry, I've got the mark scheme, so everything I've said perfectly okay. Hope. No, it is. Okay, so 1E says discuss the case for each EU country setting its minimum wage at 60% of the national average wage. Now, the key thing for this question is to look at this last paragraph that I put on the board here. So, remember the last paragraph I put on the board says, if you look in the data response, obviously, not if you look, in the data response, it talks about most EU countries have a national minimum wage which is 30 to 50% of their national average wage. Some countries, such as France and Belgium, have this at 45%. So basically, that's the key thing we need to discuss. So, what the EU was thinking, as it says in the data response, is to make all countries in the EU, so even the ones that are currently set at 30% of their national average wage, is the national minimum wage, they want all of them to put it up to 60%. And we need to comment on the benefits and drawbacks that that might have for each country. Now, we don't need to pick up each individual country in the EU and know their national minimum wage in terms of as a percentage of their national average wage. Obviously, you're not expected to know that. So, obviously, we need to pick out each individual country. They're just talking about groups of countries that may have maybe 30%, and some countries that may be closer to the 50% margin that's currently there. Okay, so the first thing I would talk about in this question, so is asking, remember it's asking about discuss the case for each EU country setting its national minimum wage at 60% of its national average wage. You have to talk about, okay, well the first thing, you need to introduce this line. You need to talk about, okay, well most EU countries have a national minimum wage which is 30 to 50% of their national average wage. However, some countries such as France and Belgium have this at 45% or greater. Okay, so that's a kind of introductory paragraph that I would have. So as I said, compared to other countries. And then the benefits it might have. So basically, if we increase, so basically, national minimum wage is, people could be on this 30%, and if the EU says, okay, well you all have to pay at least 60% of your national average wage, then obviously this is going to increase incomes for the people that are on the borderline of the national minimum wage. Obviously, when you increase it, no matter what, they're going to have to be paid more. Okay, so basically, we know that incomes are increasing. Not all of them, but the ones at the lower end that are being obviously pushed up by this new national minimum wage. So the incomes that I put increase in Y, that just means increase in income. So therefore, if the increase in income, obviously they could spend more, so consumer spending increases for the people that are on the lower incomes. So essentially what this means is the standard of living increases. And if the standard of living increases, that means, sorry, you don't really need to see these points actually, one way around. So income increases, so that increases consumer spending, increases standard of living. So we can also say that the income inequality decreases, because obviously the people at the top, we're assuming their wage stays the same. It's just the people at the bottom that have been given an extra boost in their wage. So their income inequality decreases. However, we're going to go into a minute how we can say the opposite of that. And then you just put, assuming high income earners stay the same. So assuming higher incomes stay the same. Okay. So that's kind of why it's a bonus. So it's kind of why it's a plus. Okay, so what's the kind of negatives of this? because obviously, as I said, it's a common known question. However, it doesn't matter what kind of business it is, whether it's labour intensive, spends more on labour, or capital intensive, spends more on machinery. They're all going to have wages. They're all going to hopefully employ some kind of humans, or some kind. The different types. There's the jackal and the gazelle, and the bull. Anyway, see, shows my knowledge of geography. I was playing on you, by the way. I'm not generally that thick. Okay, so going back to this economic stuff we're doing. I say that a lot. I get sidetracked by myself. Right, so we said that increase in the national minimum wage 6% for all countries would have the bonus of increasing income, decreasing income inequality, as we said. But what are the negatives of that? Well, we know that wages, as I said, relate to costs, because they represent a cost. There has to be paid off. The business has to pay the wage as a cost. Essentially, it's a cost of production. It's a cost of. It's a factor of production. It's a cost of labour. So the first thing I would say, okay, well, wages represent costs. So if wages increasing because the national minimum wage increases, then the cost for the business increase. Okay, so if the cost for the business increase, then obviously if the business costs increase and they want to combat this by either increasing prices or increasing. So if the business wanted to increase, if they want, because obviously most business profit maximisers, if the wages increase, the costs increase, these prices increase, therefore, and we have a cost push spiral. Because the workers say, okay, the price is increasing, we want a high wage, and you continue. Cost push, wage spiral. Where we have this all increasing due to cost push inflation. However, the business may not decide to do that, may not decide to pay everyone a higher wage. It may decide to lay off some of these workers, because obviously the higher the cost, they want to keep the cost down, so the only way of keeping the cost down, obviously you can't pay them a lower wage, because that's the national minimum wage, it'd be illegal, it gets sacked. Then obviously they need to lay off some workers to reduce the cost, so therefore we have an increase in unemployment. And if we have an increase in unemployment, assuming the benefit system works, which obviously in this country it doesn't, but that's my opinion, I'm pretty sure it's other people's, but anyway, the increase in unemployment, therefore they should have a reduced income. And if there's a reduced income, then we have an increase in income inequality, which is the opposite of what we've said. There's a bonus to this. So it's a good evaluative point to say, income inequality can decrease, but it can also actually increase income inequality. So the examiners love that when you contradict yourself. Well, not straight away in a paragraph. I think that, but anyway, okay, so that's a positive reason and a negative reason why the increase of national minimum wage 6% may be good and it may be bad. So it may be good because it increases the standard of living for the people on the higher wages, on the lower wages, and the higher wages stay the same, so therefore income inequality decreases. However, we know wages represent costs, so they're either pushed on as high prices and a wage price spiral, or workers are actually laid off because we need to reduce the costs, so therefore income inequality, incomes decrease, so therefore income inequality increases, contradictory to what we said just a minute ago. Okay, so this is an 8 marks, so obviously we definitely need to do some kind of conclusion for this. So, overall, if you're not sure of how to conclude something or compare something, you always talk about magnitude as a last. Well, you always do that anyway, but as a last resort, always mention the magnitude of whatever you're talking about has an effect, because obviously a greater change in the variable, in this case an increase in the wage, a higher wage increase obviously makes more of an impact. Now, what we're talking about here, higher wage costs could potentially lead to higher unemployment. If there's a higher wage cost, then there'll be higher unemployment, and if there's an even higher wage increase, then there'll be an even higher national minimum wage, be an even higher level of unemployment, assuming they lay off workers, obviously, rather than pushing prices onto the consumers. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is it depends on the country's current wage. Obviously, it depends on the magnitude of the wage increase. However, we also need to look at their current percentage of the national minimum wage. Now, obviously, a country that's on 30% national minimum wage of its national average wage, if they increase that to 60%, it's doubled it. So it's insanely it's a massive jump in terms of, so the effect on unemployment is going to be much greater because we've increased the wages in that country by a considerable amount. However, France and Belgium, they're already at 45% or greater, so it'll only be a maximum of 15% increase in their wages, so it's not really going to affect the lower paid workers as much. And therefore you could say, well, the benefits might not be as great, but also the drawbacks won't be as great. So they won't be as great as unemployment, an increase in unemployment as there would be for your countries that have 30%. So it's all comparable to what country you're looking at. Okay, so that's the two evaluation points that you need to do. So just to recap, go through that question again because it's quite difficult. It says discuss the case for each EU country setting its national minimum wage at 60% of its average national wage. We need to compare. You need to think, okay, well, if the people on lower wages are going to be having an increased wage, increased standard of living, income inequality decreases. However, we know that increased wages are a representation of an increase in costs, so they can either be passed on in terms of continued inflation and a wage spiral, or the profits can be kept high by laying off costs, by laying off workers, and therefore that increases income inequality. But obviously, the change in wage is going to be different from each country, and that depends on what their current wage level is. It depends on what their current national minimum wage is as a percentage of their national average wage, because they're all going to be increased to 60 as proposed. So obviously the ones that are lower, that have a lower percentage, are going to have an increase in their wages. Alright, and obviously it depends on the magnitude, which is kind of just what we've double clarified there. Alright, so that's a data response of OCR's A2 F583 Economics for June 2015. I probably said that twice. So I do apologise about this video. As I said, obviously exams are online, so I'll probably get sacked for taking this off, so watch it while you can. As I said, you've probably all done your mocks anyway now, so it's completely irrelevant, it's just another video to watch. Quite a hard data response as you imagined. Well, maybe if you've already done this topic, it's quite easy. But hopefully it's the first three parts are fairly easy. The second two are a little bit more complicated, but it's just a case of thinking it. And actually, most of that is related to F581. Maybe not the last little bit there, but quite a few key bits definitely in that data response that you could have done without doing F583 at all. Okay, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you hopefully in the actual. I'm going to obviously go through the proper questions, so questions 2 to 4, and I'll put them up as separate questions. So anyway, thanks for watching. Sorry for this extremely long video, but hopefully I've tried to keep it as short as I can, even though it's almost like an hour. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.